Dear listeners of our Progressiva podcast, welcome to a new edition. Today, we're going to think of the coming very important election, namely the European Parliament election in June of next year. We're going to think of them from a particular perspective, because next year, so 2024, is going to be a quite important and actually, well, in a sense, future deciding year, as we're going to have also presidential elections in the US. So we have the two big continents or the two states, bigger states organizations in the Western world having elections. This may cause a general shift, may have some influences that go far beyond these years of our lives. And in this perspective, we want to discuss what's going to happen with two guests we are very happy to welcome. These are two colleagues from the same university in Berlin. One we know already from a previous podcast you can find from around 2 years ago. That's Professor Boris Vormann and the colleague Professor Ebert. So we're going to have first an introduction, speaking a little bit about their work, what they do, who they are, for them who have forgotten about Boris Vormann. And then we'll enter the topic as usual. So let's start. I would say we have a new entry here in the podcast episode. So let's start with you, Berit. So what do you want to tell us about you? What's the most important feature?
Thank you so much, Arturo, and it's thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to take part of that. So yeah, my name is Berit Ebert. I joined Bard College in January of this year. My research concerns mostly gender equality, the rule of law, and multi-level governance in the European Union. Most recently, I've worked a lot on Poland, on the recent judicial reforms there, and how the rule of law intersects with gender equality in that context. And more broadly, my interest lies in finding out how individual citizens actually shape in what is happening at and in and with the European Union. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you. And Boris, we know you already, but refreshing the memory is always a good habit.
Yes, exactly. I would not be angry at anyone who forgot. I'm a professor at Bard College Berlin since 2017. I teach politics, comparative politics, but also political economy. My work has been on American politics, transatlantic relations, broader historical questions of American state building, political development. I'm interested in questions of legitimacy. How can we understand the crisis of democracy that we're facing, both in the US and across really most states? And I've also developed a somewhat peculiar interest in infrastructures, logistical infrastructures in particular, because they seem essential for military purposes and business, commercial purposes. And so I've been interested in how the state has been building these networks on a global level. So the relationship between the state and globalization and the possibility and potential for democracy, this is the kind of work that I've been engaged in for the last couple of years.
So I have to say that I'm already looking forward to start the conversation with you, because hearing more in detail what you're doing, I have already a lot of ideas of what we could discuss. But before, let's dig a little bit into the Bard College, having the privilege of having two perspectives about the Bard College. I mean, Berit, you studied before in Vienna, while I know that you, Boris, have been at the Freie Universität before. So these are two big universities, kind of representative, I think, of big public universities. Would you say that the Bard College is characteristic in some respect compared to these former universities we spoke of?
I mean, I studied at the University of Vienna. I did a master's program in European Studies, which was actually very small. So I was sitting in a classroom with 14 other students and had quite an international experience already there, a very intense experience. And this is something that I also find at Bard College. It's small and it's highly international. We have roughly 360 students coming from roughly 70 countries, and this also translates into the classrooms. So it's focused on participation, discussion, and very intensive learning and class readings, allowing really for individual development. And that diversity and nationality is very much expressed in the faculty. So I have this with the students that I'm interacting with daily and with my colleagues. And this is certainly unique in the German context. I always consider Bard College somewhat of an international hub in Pankow. We should also not forget that there is a close link to Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson, which was established in 1860 as St. Stephen College. And fun fact, in the mid-1930s and throughout the Second World War, Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson was a sort of a haven for distinguished writers, artists, intellectuals, and scientists fleeing from Europe. And among them was also the social critic Hannah Arendt and her husband Heinrich Blücher. And both are buried there at the Bard College Cemetery. And it was finally Heinrich Blücher who established and anchored the so-called core curriculum at Bard College in Annandale, which now also forms the cornerstone of Bard College Berlin's education. So there is we also have this transatlantic link.
Yeah, wow, and quite a history related to big names, which I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, no, good place. It's a good place. It's compared to the Freie Universität. I mean, I came from the John F. Kennedy Institute, which has a bit of a similar trajectory, I think, because it was founded by Ernst Fraenkel in the post-war years, and it was also trying to do something interdisciplinary. And I think this is something that the liberal arts approach is also trying to do, to try and ask big questions and not over-specialize too early, and be able to make connections and associative links between different disciplinary traditions. So they're exposed at our college, or students are, to a very broad range of disciplinary thought and methods, and yeah, it's quite a unique place, I find.
Yeah, it sounds indeed like a place I would enjoy. I'm also a sustainer of a universalistic education, taking in different aspects. That's why I focus so much on thermodynamics, which already Einstein defined to be the most general of all science branches.
But I wouldn't have been able to tell from the outside that it's not specialized. But
well, but everything has to obey the laws of energy, right? And maybe they would be also better fit to describe economy instead of deterministic, mechanistic Newtonian laws as the current economy does. But this is a discussion for a podcast itself, I believe. Where I'm sure that both of us would have a lot of interest, but we had already announced a topic, which is the EU and the US election. So let's start with a brief overview. Most of all, so what is going to be exactly, I ask you, Boris, for the USA, what is going to be exactly elected next year? And is it going to be really a shift in power and policies or not really? What should our expectation be given what is being elected?
The second question is difficult to answer. The first one, I'm glad to try. So yes, it's the presidential election above all that is in the media discourse and that everybody's discussing. Every 4 years in the US, a new president is being elected, even though, to be more specific, actually what's being elected is the Electoral College. And that will then elect the president. And the Electoral College is this odd kind of institutional invention from the founding fathers in the late 18th century, who generally found the idea of democracy to sound good, but still didn't want to quite trust in it too much. And so they used the Electoral College basically as a safety valve in order to make sure that it's not too democratic, right? And that not everyone can really have an effect on the elections. And there are several compromises that were made at the time, but so the presidential election is one of the things that's going to happen in November, but also The Congress, the Senate is being re-elected. A third of the Senate is being re-elected every 4 years at the same time. And then the House of Representatives, which is also a part of the Congress, is also being re-elected. The House of Representatives, the elections take place every 2 years, so that every representative is really continuously on an election campaign. And so the idea behind that was that they would have to be listening very carefully to their constituencies and not to drift off into the abstract national politics. And so this was an idea of sort of a temporal check beyond the separation of powers and the checks of balances between the president and the Congress and then the Supreme Court. There was this temporal way to make sure that there are many elections. And that's the case for the US, and it'll be particularly the case next year.
One question to dig a little bit deeper. You were speaking of the Electoral College as an agreement, also given a mistrust toward the democratic instrument. Now, if we compare it to a parliamentarian democracy where the head of government, so the executive, is also not elected directly, but through the parliament, is this comparable, or are there other aspects which are not so compliant to democratic ideals as they are nowadays?
I think there's one very important distinction, which is that the president and the Congress are not elected in the same type of election. So there's a certain independence between the two, and they can be divided government, which in parliamentary systems is not the case. You can have votes of no confidence, and there's other ways to check. Also, what we've seen in parliamentary democracies is that coalition finding has been taking more and more time in the last couple of years. It's been very difficult. If we look at the German elections, it took a lot of time for the coalition to actually be established. But in the US, this works differently. So you have a separation between the presidential election and the congressional election. And therefore, there can be unified government if both are in the hands of one party. But oftentimes there's divided government, as there is right now, where the Republicans have majorities in the Congress and not, well, at least in the House of Representatives, and not with the president.
Before moving on to the EU and to Berit, I'd like to further specify the question of before, because it was based on a metaphor. The question was related to the institution. I mean, we have an electoral college which then elects a president. And the question is if this is not similarly a democratic legitimation as a parliament that elects a head of government, or if there is something about the electoral college that is less democratic than the way we elect indirectly our head of government.
Okay, well, this digs deep, and I think you have your finger on something. Of course, in both cases, we're speaking of large-scale democracies. So we're not speaking about the Greek antiquity and the polis, where you have everyone of the people who are electing someone knowing one another and even rotating in positions. But you have large-scale democracy, which is basically modern mass society. And so you have representative mechanisms in both contexts, which has been the solution to the problem of how do you govern millions of people rather than just thousands of people, but which comes with some cost. And Jan Werner Müller, in his book on populism, I think he describes this very, very well. He says, well, there's always someone who can point out that those who are representing us aren't really representing the true people. So there's always a lingering doubt in representative democracies, which Müller calls this the shadow of liberal democracy. And I think that's a problem that is true for both parliamentary systems and presidential systems, I would say.
Okay, now let's move back to our continent. Ebert, which one of the institutional actors are we going to renew at the next electoral campaign? 2019, it were a lot of persons that changed. For example, also the head of the central bank. Is it going to be the same now?
Well, I would give you the answer of a legal scholar here, which usually starts with "it depends." And in that case, it depends on which policy area of the European Union you look at. It depends where the European Union actually has competencies in and where it doesn't. So, for example, when we look at everything that concerns foreign and security policy, where still the European Council, the heads of states and member state, heads of government and state are in the driver's seat, I would say it's certainly the Council, and there a lot is still focused on what actually happens in the member states and what the election of a what the outcome of a national election actually is. So that is one aspect. When we move from that area, and in that regard, by the way, that body will be extremely important, because as we all know, in October of this year, members of the European Parliament submitted several proposals with regard to reforming the Treaty of Lisbon. The final negotiations of that will be done by the national governments, and so this is certainly a big topic for the next years in the European Union, where the national governments again are in the driver's seat, and we can also speak a little bit about what is being proposed here. When we talk about competencies that sit within the European Union and that sit within the legislative process there, of course, the European Commission is decisive. It has the legislative initiative. This would be changed should the Parliament's proposal be carried out, and the Commission would look completely different. So far it is put in place also by the heads of states and government. So with regard to that, of course, however the Commission will be composed will be important. The European Parliament, yes, can suggest a candidate for the presidency of the European Commission, but so far the Council does not have to follow suit. We've seen this in the last election when Manfred Weber was actually proposed as Commission President, and Ursula von der Leyen finally got the post. So this is a possibility, but with regard to the treaty, in no way mandatory. The treaty reform again would change this and would basically have Parliament propose the president or put in place the president for the European Commission, and the Council would then have to agree. So this would be a complete reversal of the roles. This would, to quite some extent, politicize the European Commission. The European Commission so far is a pretty technocratic institution, with the mandate of being the guardian of the treaties, of being solely responsible to European values. So we might, if the reform carries through, we might see a very different Commission. And I personally doubt if that reform proposal will be beneficial or not, especially with regard to my own personal research in Poland and, for example, safeguarding the rule of law, where the political independence of the European Commission was quite important, and that detachment. It really strongly carried through the safeguarding of the values that are enshrined in Article 2 in the Treaty of Lisbon. The counter argument to that would be, but the national governments are also elected, and they will impose the commissioners according to their political preferences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if I sum up correctly, the key role for the next years you see mainly by the Council, given the so-called conference, the results of the Conference on the Future of Europe, on which we also had a podcast with some member of the European parliaments, which is basically an attempt to reform the institution, and it's about the Council, how to change the treaties or not. So the key role will be of the Council, which will not change with the European election next year. So what will change is the Parliament and the Commission. Maybe one question, further follow-up question to you. You have pointed out the importance of the Commission nowadays as non-political institution, as how it is perceived in Poland, and how beneficial it could be to be a political one. Now, the chairman of the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, if there are rumors, she will attempt a second time to be in the position. She had also a very little, not a broad majority in the first election, but then her policy were normally carried out or sustained by a broad majority within the European Parliament, reaching from conservatives over the Greens to the Social Democrats and the Liberals. Do you think we are going to see a new Commission president next year?
That is a very interesting question. This is like, the playing.
It's a speculation. I mean, of course, it's just speculation.
It's pure speculation. If the party outcome is roughly the same as in the last election, I think the chances might be there. She has actually done, I would say, from a European perspective, a pretty good job. She has really actively pushed through most of her priorities. I think chances could be very likely that a second term is possible. Yes.
Okay, so let's see if this is going to be, and most of all, we are very action curious to see which majorities there will be in the next European Parliament. But again, we have the chance here of having two experts of two different continents, or union or federal states, or international cooperations of two continents. So let's have a look a little bit to the relation, the USA and the European Union. What is the state of the art? Maybe we can start again from the US perspective and then integrate with you, Ebert. So Boris, when we speak of the state of the art, we had the traumata of the Trump administration. Has it changed so much with the Biden administration? What is the state of the art of our cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, after Biden was elected, there was a very strong sigh of relief that you could hear even through the windows in Germany, in many places, I would say. And there was the hope that there would be some kind of a return to the status quo ante, to transatlantic relations, perhaps with Obama or even the Clinton years or so. So Biden was always seen as someone who's had a long political career and who knew the Cold War, and so would be interested in this kind of transatlantic relationship. And of course, people were expecting a pivot from Trump. And I think in part that's true. That's what happened. I mean, there is certainly a different type of tone. Amy Gutmann, as an ambassador here in Berlin, has been trying to talk to many people and go to many places and try and also heal some of the wounds that came from the Trump administration. The change in tone in terms of Biden's own rhetoric is noticeable. Not just that, I think there is a reappreciation also of the importance of Europe in geopolitical and geostrategic terms, especially with the attack on Ukraine. I think there has been a realization of that. So there's been a shift away from the pre-Trump era that Trump had also started, one must say, away from the pivot to Asia. So away from the Pacific arena back towards transatlantic questions. So that's for sure. But I would say what we can notice nonetheless are some continuities. And it's not just a matter of rhetoric. I think there is still a fundamental difference, of course, between Biden and Trump. But we do see more fundamental shifts on a planetary level, which are related also to a shifting power balance with China. And a reorganization away from the ideals of free trade of the post-Cold War moment towards renationalization, focus on manufacturing industries trying to reduce and to shrink supply chains and try and produce more regionally. There's an awareness of the inequalities and an attempt to address these. The IRA the Inflation Reduction Act has been one major piece of legislation of Biden's first half of his administration, where they're trying to do exactly that, right? To bring about also a socio-ecological transformation that Trump didn't even talk about. So I think the shift towards nationalism, back to national questions, the turning away from free trade is a more fundamental shift that we already see in Trump, that we see continued in Biden. But I think Biden has another sense of the importance of this pivotal geostrategic role of Europe for the US. So I think this is how I would describe it. So, and I should go back to the first question that I didn't answer. It does make a huge difference if Biden will be reelected or if Trump will be elected. If somebody else will be, elected, that remains to be seen. That's maybe a small open question, but it's very likely that it's going to be the contest between the two again. But the outcome would be very different, even though I do think we have fundamental shifts that we will continue to see.
In short, question about what you just mentioned. When are the primaries going to finish? And when it will be clear with 100% certainty that it's going to be a Trump vs. Biden?
I guess that also depends not only on the primaries, but it also depends on the courts and the decisions that are being made there. We see some shifts, some support that Nikki Haley is getting suddenly. It seems like Ron DeSantis is pretty much out of the race, but who knows if Nikki Haley can still compete at some point. In the spring, over the course of the spring until May or June, we should pretty much know who the candidate is, obviously, and then we'll see what happens.
And now let's turn back to the European perspective. So what about the state of art from European perspective? And I would add directly the next topic to discuss, namely, how could they be affected by the European elections?
So I think in general, I agree with what Boris has said. I would perhaps slightly reduce the strong emphasis on renationalization, which of course I have to do since I'm talking for the European Union here, and there is a focus on free trade. And Boris mentioned the IRA. Of course, we all know the European Union has its problems with it. EU firms are at the risk of being excluded from US automotive supply chains, and President von der Leyen has expressed her discontent with that. So yes, there is, for example, in that regard, there is the relationship is not conflict-free, but at the same time, both partners are working on it. In March of this year, the two presidents have met and have discussed possible ways out of that in a special agreement for the US and the European Union. And not only the European Union has an interest in that, the US has an interest in that too, since that would reduce dependency on China for critical minerals. So I would be slightly more positive there. I mean, we also all know that that there is no free trade agreement between the US and the European Union. The negotiations have stopped in 2019. Nevertheless, transatlantic trade continues to enjoy one of the lowest average tariffs worldwide. It is below 3%, and this shows that not everything needs to be institutionalized in order to be successful. And I think that speaks in a way also to the strength of that relationship, and especially, yes, as I already said, since the EU is about free trade, I think I'm quite positive in that regard. So now, with regard to the parliamentary elections, again, I fully believe that the European parliamentary elections have to be seen in synergy with whatever outcome is in any member state of the European Union. We have democratically elected national governments, and we have the democratically elected European Parliament, and both work together in the European context. Should there be a slightly more right-wing shift, as we probably all anticipate in the European elections, then of course the outcome of the parliament would reflect what is the outcome of many national elections right now. Again, it depends on which policy area of the European Union we're looking at. The treaties of the European Union are pretty clear what has to be done with regard to trade and the economy. When we look at foreign policy, there could be, of course, there could be a shift, yes, and there could be. We've already seen it with Hungary, but again, we're talking about the government position here. I would say there might be a slight impact, but perhaps not such a big impact on EU-US relations by the parliamentary elections. The driving force comes from somewhere else.
I would also say that the US will be the more important actor in tipping the balance. And it's sure that if Trump is reelected, that the way that he has acted in international institutions and organizations like NATO, I think he knows how the American state functions now. And I think a second term, and I'm not the only one to say this, would be much more radical than what we saw in the first term. And I think that also goes for foreign policy and for international organizations.
So 2 thoughts from my side. The first one is that basically here we see the importance of institution, because in this comparison, we have an outcome of the election that may be determinant for the foreign policy. And on our side of the Atlantic, it's actually not the case. Because foreign policy is mainly driven by the council, and here the national governments changing much lower are determinant, and not so much the executive of the European Union, so the Commission. This is quite interesting to see in this clarity what an impact an institutional arrangement can have.
Yeah. If I may add to that, this is also exactly the institutional arrangement and the treaties. There is not much. You don't have much of a playground. You don't have much. The European treaties are much more than any national constitution could be in that regard, because you have prescribed policies. And unless, and there we are again with the individual member states, unless the member states decide to significantly change the treaties, we can expect, I think, a continuation of what is going on right now.
That's quite interesting. Let's paying attention not to get loose on this track from the main topic, but speaking of how strict the treaties are actually dictating, if I understand your argument correctly, is that the treaties themselves kind of give a direction of general foreign policy for the European Union, which is much more constrained than the constraints that the USA administration has. So if this is your argument, my question would be, could we say the same with respect to other policy fields, for example, fiscal policy, which also constrains a lot, not only the European government, the European Commission, but then single national government more than it is done in the US?
Well, so definitely, again, where the European Union has competencies is very strict. So this is precisely not so much the case in foreign and security policy. If you look at the foreign and security policy of the European Union, it's much more reactionary and less strategic, determining oriented than any other national foreign policy. Humanitarian crisis, financial aid, and so forth. Usually something has happened and then the European Union kicks in. There is not necessarily a strategic vision in how the European Union wants to change certain regions of the world. So that is precisely not the case where it's regulated. The regulated case in the treaties is exactly that. It's trade, it's economic policy, it's in part also social policy, everything that concerns the work sphere. There is so much content in those treaties that you would never find anywhere else, and there the wiggling room is not as big as in a national context. Yes.
Boris, do you want to add something, or?
No, I was just thinking about, but this might come across as off topic, but I was just thinking about and a little nerdy as well, about the foundation of the US. And because it was founded as 13 sovereign states, basically. And the first treaty was the Articles of Confederation, and there wasn't even a single a unified military, and taxation was at the state level and not at the federal level. So there was no federal government, basically. And the war for independence was what made it necessary for there to be more political clout at the top, basically, and more coordination at the federal level. And so many of these competencies that Berit was talking about, you know, when it comes to commerce inside the national territory, or let's say the federal territory, and also defense, this is what propelled forward the unity and the upscaling of governance questions. So I was just thinking about this parallel, but I
would say that this is an interesting parallel also into perspective, because we see nowadays also a situation where the European Union as a whole is indirectly involved in a war, namely the one in Ukraine. And we could state that it's propelling a discussion about military union, also driven by the conference on the future of Europe we were speaking about, that was not so clear before. And by before I mean the last 40 years, because at the beginning, of course, but then again it was coming also from a war. The moment where the competences were more unified between the sovereign states forming the US, was that the Hamilton moment? Because looking at these terms of the Commission, there was a moment where we spoke of a Hamilton moment for the European Union, which was a war, in a sense, the war against Corona, where there was for the first time debt in the European Union.
There's a great, just a footnote, there's a great edited volume by Ira Katz-Nelson, which is called Shaped by Trade and War. And the argument is exactly that, you know, that trade and war are what makes states develop their competencies. And then many of the other things follow. And I think it's certainly true for the US. Hamilton is often cited as not just as a Broadway figure, but also as one of the founding fathers who was influential in that regard. He had been forgotten for quite a while because with neoliberalism there was a strong emphasis on laissez-faire capitalism. So the U.S. as American capitalism as laissez-faire, and so Hamilton only seemed to play a negligible role in U.S. development. But there's been a number of publications in the recent years about Hamilton that are foregrounding his impact. And when you look at the first half of the 19th century, actually, you will see that it's not only Hamilton that pushes for, in his report for manufacturers, for example, he pushes for, you know, a certain type of protectionism and also trying to protect infant industries and build infrastructures and so on. But when you look at that history, you also see that that Jefferson, who's often pitted against him as sort of the opposite figure, once in office takes very similar approaches, because it becomes clear, oh, in order to have a military, in order to have this infrastructure and develop the land and expand westward, it was necessary to have a unified government. And so interestingly, you know, even those that we associate with a laissez-faire approach weren't that laissez-faire after all. So I think there is a realization now, and I think it's a broader mood. If you look also at social science literature after 2008, Mariana Mazzucato, Mark Blythe, you know, a number of people, Fred Block and so on, were all emphasizing how important the state has always been. Jamie Peck, even, you know, even during the victorious moment of neoliberalism post-1989, the state never withered away, but was always present. And there's been a huge literature that has grown in the last 10 years or so that's pointing these Hamiltonian traits out quite substantially. Yeah.
And this fits very well into the discussion we have about the role of state in the European Union. So I think this was a very broad, though a little off of track, very valuable contribution. Just remember how high also the taxes on the richest person were in the US before the Reagan administration, which was far over 50%. But now let's track back to the concluding part of our podcast, which is a look to the future. So what is the role of Europe in the strategic vision? I mean, Berit has already outlined how there is a lack of a strategic, institutionally constrained lack of a strategic vision of what Europe wants to do as European Union in the world. But this is different for the US. So what is the role that Europe has to play for the US interest, and how far does it depend from the outcome of the election?
It depends fundamentally on the outcome of the election. I think Trump doesn't have a grand vision of American foreign policy. I think for him it's selective. For him, the decisive thing is, well, he says America first, but really it's Trump first. So the decisive point for him is how can it maximize his power and make him look good, basically. That's, I mean, if you look at the foreign policy agenda of his first administration, that's the bottom line. There is no broader vision of what role the EU should play or not. It's more about a zero-sum perspective where the US can win from others losing. It's a very, very sort of bipolar kind of vision of international relations. For Biden, I think he is realizing not just that Europe is important, I think there's also a realization that the reason why the US has become the hegemon after 1945 was because it built these international institutions and because it was willing to provide a series of global public goods. The dollar, the institutions of the World Bank and the IMF, security umbrella for Europe. So there were, and all the bases that they built up. So the post-1989 moment, we often see it as the peak of neoliberalism, so market-driven society, but it's also the peak of American power. And it's the American state and American hegemony that has built the institutional architecture for that moment to emerge. And I think Biden is aware of that, if the US wants to play the same kind of role, I think he's realizing it can't play the same kind of role because of China, but if it still wants to be an important actor or a dominant hegemon, at least for the hemisphere and Europe and Africa, I guess, then it needs to step up its game, and it also needs to provide these global public goods again. The problem is that it is facing a divided Congress. The question of gridlock will not go away. It will be much more difficult still to mobilize the kind of resources that you need for that. So he's faced with, I think, a fundamental dilemma that he can't really resolve. So yeah, no matter who gets elected, I guess the crisis is either accelerated through Trump or protracted through Biden. I'm going to close with a more optimistic statement, but let me just stop here for a moment.
I'll have also a more optimistic closing question to be sure we leave on a positive note. But yeah, let's hear now this question we have already pointed out is tricky because Europe has not, according to the treaties, a strategic vision to be developed. Yet it has certain interest. How does the European Union want to have the US as a partner?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, foreign policy is one side of the coin, and there is, of course, also trade and economics. And I think given the close trade relations, of course, the US has a huge role to play for the European Union. There is a huge interest in keeping the relation going. But even in the foreign and security policy area, as we see with Ukraine, there is the need to work together, and still in terms of values, these two continents are broadly aligned. So I would absolutely say that the US plays a big role in long-term European strategic interests. Absolutely, yeah.
Now, one last question, then a concluding one. The last one is. If we look about the campaigns which are starting now, I've been in Strasbourg last week, and I could really feel when Sanchez was making a review over the Spain presidency of the European Council, that the parliament is already in a mood of campaign. The attacks were harsh. The parties are starting to confront themselves with the electorates. So can we identify some topics that are common to the two campaigns, the one starting the US and the one starting in Europe already? Berit, I think. We can just start with you to change a little bit, surprise our listeners with some unexpected order.
What we see on the European side is of course we see a lot of talk about the war in Ukraine, what role the European Union should play in that. Climate change, the Green Deal is a big topic with a lot of parties. We're seeing this right now. The Socialists and Democrats, I'm very happy to see that they even address the equality between men and women and are very much in line with President Ursula von der Leyen. Another topic that we see across party lines is immigration. Of course, how immigration is being dealt with differs very much from the parties. And here it's also interesting to see the role that the European Union played in the history of immigration policy on the European level, because I think, and here the election outcome might be decisive, we see that that a lot of states, especially right-wing governed states, use the European Union to implement a stricter immigration policy. So the reason to collaborate is not necessarily to open up and the usual story that we associate the union with. It's actually rather closing. Other topics concern the fight for terrorism, securing jobs, and also how do we deal with the whole the institutional setup of the European Union, democracy, the rule of law. Of course, this is not really a topic that we would find in the US election.
Boris, could you find some matches for the topics in the US?
Yeah, I think immigration for sure. I mean, this is what all the conservative parties are emphasizing. This is what Trump has been doing all along. I mean, it's also a lot of fear-mongering, pointing to the border. So I think for Trump, it's pretty clear that this will be a campaign about immigration, Hunter Biden, the son of Joe Biden's, and his potential corruption cases. It will mostly be about, I think, creating fear and pointing out how Biden was endangering the United States. I think this is relatively clear. For Biden, I think he will probably have to somehow show that his stamina is sufficient. I mean, stamina was also a big debate in 2016 at the time with Hillary Clinton, but Biden has to be able to show that he can survive another 4 years, not just politically, but also physically. This will be something that people have been emphasizing a lot, even though Trump is not much younger, obviously, he's just 3 years younger. But then he will try something that they haven't done very well yet, which is to point out the legislative successes of the first 2 years, like the IRA or like the CHIPS Act. And there were a couple of pieces of legislation that were quite fundamental, and I think in terms of numbers and scope, quite comparable even to Franklin D. Roosevelt. So I mean, I think that, you know, there are some quite historical things in terms of investments in infrastructure and social policy, which unfortunately for Biden sometimes will only have their effect 10 years, 20 years down the line. And so it might not help him for this election. So the question is how to present the successes of Biden's for this coming year. The other big question is, of course, the Palestine-Israel war, where a lot of his progressive supporters, the young supporters in particular, have been turning away from him because of his support for Israel. And then you also have some Afro-American and Latin American voters that have been turning away from Biden. So it's very early. There's still a lot of time. It doesn't make much sense to look at the national polls in the first place, but also not from, you know, so early on. But it's true that it will be a pretty tough presidential competition.
Okay. Well, this brings is then the closing word related to the topic of today. But before, I have a more personal question, because beyond being experts for different areas, you are also European citizens. So it's going to be an important moment also for you personally. So my question is, what is important personally to you that the European Union tackles. What is your expectation? What is the hope that you connect to the next legislature in the European Parliament? And I think hopes are always a great way to close discussions. So, Berit, let's start with you.
So, okay, my personal view about the European Union and what do I hope for? I mean, let me start a bit broader here. I mean, I'm always, and especially also teaching in the context of Bard College, where I teach a lot of international students. I very often hear from the students, wow, this is so impressive what you have achieved. This would be impossible in our countries. That actually 27 countries sit together and achieve that. If we look where the European Parliament came from, and now we're talking about direct elections, and now we're and even more reform, I think this is already quite impressive. What do I hope for? I actually made a note here on my documents when I prepared for that, and this hasn't really come up in the conversation. So thank you for giving me that moment. Whatever is being decided in terms of democratic reform, what I really hope for is that the institutions that will decide on that and that will implement that do not forget how important education is in that context. It's wonderful what is, or not everything, but there are good approaches what is being proposed with regard to the reform of the treaties. It's great that the citizens should have a greater moment and be more responsible within the entire European project. But in order to be responsible, you have to know what you're doing. And I think it's easy to say, okay, now the parliament has more powers, but this also means the citizens of Europe have more powers. And that means they have to fulfill their role in a responsible manner. I think it's very, very important that Europe doesn't lose sight of the importance of education. And there are very many initiatives that are already going on. And I would really personally hope that more is being done. There cannot be done enough in that regard.
I'm very happy that a topic that is normally not so present in the discussions at European level, namely the Conference on the Future of Europe. So this attempt to reform the treaties is so present in this discussion, which actually is more on a global topic. But yes, indeed, I believe that the capability of the European institution to reform themselves profoundly is going to play a key role. And that's the moment actually to tackle also the fields which we believe should have a prominent role to play in the next years. And education for sure is one of them. What about you, Boris? Now speaking of Europe as well, you're back to our continent.
I think, it's good to end on an optimistic note. Sometimes it's a bit of a ritual, but I think in this context, it is important to stress that optimism, or at least an open future, is fundamental for democracy. So democracy is about people being able to govern themselves and deciding about the projects that they want to engage in the future. So we need a future in order to do that. And the apocalyptic visions that have been so dominant in years and that have been politicized and instrumentalized politically is something that one should be very aware of. I mean, doesn't mean that we have to be naive and force ourselves somehow to be optimistic, but we should also think a little bit about the kinds of achievements that have been made. I watched the Trevor Noah comedy special, Netflix special yesterday night, and he was talking about the German anthem and the German national identity and memory culture. It was interesting because from the outside view, he was quite impressed apparently with how Germans did not bury their past underneath the ground, but were foregrounding it and were trying to make sense of it. So anyways, what I think is important that there is some kind of a European discourse, a new European discourse that emerges. I think it's been too technical. I think people can't really identify with the European Union. I think it's essential for economic and geopolitical reasons. We cannot compete on a global level with China and the US and Russia by being just these small nation states. We need to realize that we're in this together somehow. And I think the fundamental crux is developing a discourse like this. And I know people have been talking about this for a long time, but it's always been a very abstract kind of discussion. But I think it's something that that needs to happen. And I think there are a lot of good things that one can think about when one thinks about Europe. And so we have to develop some solidaristic projects that also try and acknowledge the suffering of individual groups and minorities and so on, and also build the institutions that protect them, but also try and develop a civic identity at the supranational level that can be the foundation for new fiscal measures and social policy and so on at a European scale. I think it's essential for this to happen. That's my hope.
I mean, to emphasize or to make this even more positive, Boris, I would even say that, especially with this parliamentary election, but also with the previous European Parliament election, we've already seen a much more public discourse than in the previous years. It's literally impossible to open a newspaper and not read anything about that, or not read about a topic that concerns the European Union, be it positive or negative. But I think that we are on a very good way in that regard.
Yeah, I may add that my personal argument is always that it's the national states that have been a relatively new invention. If we go back, we have a common European history, we have a language that is very similar. I mean, when I've been in China, I realized that things that I believed to be human were actually Europeans, the certain structure of the language, the thing of having verbs, nouns, the same alphabet. There it starts, but it goes much more beyond this. And we have actually a common cultural origin. Our scientific achievements also in the field of natural science were possible because there were scientists that already 1,000 years ago were used to move across borders, and national languages are something that was very recently also developed. And we have that is what unites Europe. We don't need a protection of minority in the sense that diversity is one of the key elements that shape the history of our countries, with many dialects, with many people, many habits. And this united in diversity as the motto of the European Union are the words with which I close this podcast. And thanks again a lot to our guests. It was a very interesting discussion, and it lasted a little longer than planned, but this often happens when we have interesting topics and we want to dig a little bit deeper than just the surface. So, dear listeners, thank you very much, and see you soon.